Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ODI Global event. I'm Sara Pantuliano, ODI Global's Chief Executive. We're here today to launch new research on school feeding, food systems reform, and the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an agenda to combat child hunger, to boost education, to transform food systems, and strengthen equity. We know very well that national school feeding programs have potentially wide-ranging and mutually reinforcing benefits across many of the SDGs. That includes education, nutrition, and child health, to name a few. But school meals coverage is far too limited, but it's needed most, and that is in low and lower middle-income countries, which account for almost 90% of global undernutrition, and an even higher share of extreme poverty. So just to quote some figures, in 2021, only 19% of children in primary school in low-income countries and 39% in lower middle-income countries, that's 157 million in total, received some form of school feeding. Many of the barriers are linked to underfinancing. So how can the politics around linking school meals with wider food system reform agenda be addressed? What would it cost to rapidly scale up school meal provision, and how can these costs be financed? And what is the evidence? What do we know about the impact of school feeding on children's nutrition, health, and educational outcomes? I'm really delighted to moderate today's event to discuss these questions around these three areas with a really distinguished panel of speakers. But before I introduce them, I'm really delighted, honored to share a special message from Right Honorable Gordon Brown, the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, who is welcoming the new report from ODI and the Sustainable Finance Initiative for School Health and Nutrition.
Let me welcome this excellent report on school feeding from the Sustainable Finance Initiative. Let me also thank ODI for hosting this important event, for it is a global scandal that in the year 2024, we have 320 million children living in households surviving on less than $2.15 a day, and that 258 million of children in poorer countries are living with hunger, with over 1/4 of children in these countries stunted by poor nutrition. As every parent and every teacher understands, a child living with the grinding reality of hunger is not going to realize the potential for learning. And in my work as UN Special Envoy for Education, I've visited dozens of countries in all continents and seen the sorrows of the left out millions and the consequences of this poverty and malnutrition in far too many schools. As the Sustainable Finance Initiative report makes clear, school feeding has a demonstrated track record in addressing poverty. Well-designed, properly financed school meal programs increase enrollment, reduce dropout rates, and improve learning outcomes. Just as the poorest children bear the greatest advantages associated with malnutrition, so they stand to reap the greatest benefits from school feeding. And of course, procurement for school meals can also create markets for school smallholder farmers and generate incentives for sustainable agriculture. And all these potential benefits for child health, education, rural livelihoods, and sustainable food systems explain why so many governments like Kenya, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Honduras are working so hard to expand the reach of school feeding programs, and why the School Meals Coalition, which now spans 103 countries and regional bodies, is committed to building a world in which every child has access to a nutritious meal by 2030. I urge bilateral aid donors and multilateral development banks to step up. Because let me end with a brief reflection from history. The establishment of school meal programs in the United Kingdom brought together charities, health professionals, educators, and many, many others united because the single cause of fighting childhood hunger and unlocking educational opportunity came together. We won against daunting odds. And while we live this time in polarized times, some causes have the power to unite the world, to galvanize coalitions of compassion, and to drive fundamental change. School feeding is such a cause. Please support it.
Well, that was a real clarion call for well-designed and properly financed school feeding programs. We have very clearly how we can apply the lessons of histories from the history of the UK itself. I think, as the Special Envoy said very clearly, it is a global scandal that so many children are living with hunger and suffering. The impact of malnutrition, being stunted, when it would actually be quite easy to address their plight. And that's why, the report was produced to try and give some clear guidance on how to address the blockages that I was referring to before. And to take us through the report, I'm really delighted, thrilled to introduce my dear friend Kevin Watkins to take us through the main findings and recommendations. Kevin is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. He's a distinguished fellow at ODI Global and a research lead of the Sustainable Finance Initiatives. He was previously director of Save the Children UK and of ODI, and has authored numerous UN flagship reports, including the Human Development Report. Kevin, over to you.
Sarah, thank you. And it's really, I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. And Sarah, if I could, I just want to thank my co-authors, Peter and Asma and Oliver, for the enormous amount of work that they put in, and all of the panelists for joining us. And I should say special call out to Anna Tony, who is taking time out from the Climate Summit to join us, which is really hugely appreciated. What I want to do, Sarah, is say a little bit about the background of how school feeding can catalyze progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. I then want to talk a little bit about the financing issues that we look at in the report and leave with a few questions for other panelists to discuss as we take the dialogue forward. So if I could have the first slide. So I think what's really interesting, if you look at the history of school feeding, it's often thought of as a very narrow intervention, which is just about education. But actually, school feeding has been right at the heart of some of the great social transformations in history. Gordon mentioned the introduction of school feeding in the UK, publicly financed school feeding. That actually happened in 1906. And it happened under a Liberal government through legislation that was jointly introduced by a Conservative, which may shock many people, and a Liberal MP. But it was actually driven by a campaign led by the woman at the bottom right corner of this picture, Margaret Macmillan, who brought together 350 charity organizations, grassroots organizations that were feeding children in industrial cities who had been brought into primary school by universal education, but she, working with public health officials, observed the impact of hunger on their ability to learn. And she drove an extraordinary campaign which resulted in Parliament adopting a legislation. And I particularly like this phrase because it has such resonance for what we're talking about today, to allow public finance for children unable by reason of lack of food to take advantage of education. And I've pulled out some other illustrations of the transformative effects of school meals. There was this extraordinary book published in 1913 by Louise Bryant, which brought together evidence from Europe and the United States to try and drive policy reform and the introduction of universal school feeding in the US, which happened very slowly. But in 1966 was integrated into Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, one of the the big progressive reforms in US social history. In 2001, the Indian Supreme Court responded to a case by the People's Union for Civil Liberties by making school feeding an enforceable human right, not just an abstract constitutional right, but a right enforceable in courts of law. In 2003, the first Lula administration brought school feeding into the Zero Hunger campaign, which I think is one of the arguably the greatest human development success story of the 21st century. And under Brazil's G20 presidency, school feeding is now being put at the top of an international agenda. for school feeding to reach an additional 150 million children through the Global Alliance on Poverty and Hunger. That goal is actually very achievable. It's fantastic leadership from Brazil to put it on the international agenda. One of the things that we wanted to do in this report is to look at the conditions under which that could be achieved. So next slide, please. We could spend a lot of time making ourselves miserable by reflecting on the SDG progress report. The UN Secretary General has warned that the SDGs are about to become what he described as an epitaph for the world that might have been. About 80% of the targets are off track, which I think tells us something about the seriousness and the credibility of the political commitment behind them. I'm not going to run through the long, depressing list, but on the current trends, extreme poverty in 2030 will be double the SDG target level. The Zero Hunger SDG commitment, there's actually been zero progress on hunger. The profile of the distribution of hunger has changed. The incidence of hunger hasn't changed. And by 2030, we'll be back roughly at 2015 levels. Over a quarter of children in low income and lower middle income countries are stunted. 70% of children are in learning poverty. That is to say, they're in school but not learning. We have about 110 million out of school. And then we have the environment and the climate crisis that Anna and others are dealing with in Baku. So I don't want to go into detail, but the backdrop to this is clearly a pretty depressing SDG story. And I also think, Sarah, a sense of political resignation. You know, there's a lot of UN hand-wringing, but not an awful lot of action to change that picture. Next slide, please, Wei. Much of the crisis that I've just described, as you said in the introduction, Sarah, is rooted in low-income and lower middle-income countries. We have about 320 million children in households on under $2.15 a day. Over 95% of those children are in low-income and lower middle-income countries. Undernutrition, it really, as you said, really heavily concentrated in low-income and lower middle-income countries. Food insecurity, that is to say, not knowing where the next meal is coming from, over 400 million. Connected to the stunting crisis, we have really high levels of micronutrient deficiency, which in turn are feeding into the learning crisis. And we have a parallel crisis of overweight and obesity, especially in lower middle income countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, but extending also into low income countries. Next slide. So the question is, how can school meals turn that downward spiral, these mutually reinforcing slow progress in the SDGs, into something positive? Well, if you went through each of the negatives that I just outlined, and you think about how school meals can make a difference, first of all, they represent an in-kind transfer to some of the poorest households in the world, and they can be designed specifically to support smallholder agriculture. So in Brazil, 30% of the procurement for school meals is earmarked for smallholder agriculture. They have a proven track record in improving nutrition and reducing micronutrient deficiency. If they're introduced at preschool, they can enable children who have been stunted to start the process of catching up. We know from the evidence that Elisabetta Arinho and others have generated that school feeding both increases employment and improves learning outcomes, especially for the poorest children. They represent a vehicle that can enable children at risk of obesity and overweight because of the marketing of food companies and towards ultra-processed, high-sugar foods, they can provide those children with a healthy alternative and encourage healthy eating habits. And procurement for school feeding can be used to create markets for regenerative agriculture. So there's a big bundle of potential benefits. I'm obviously skating over the detail of the evidence, which we can discuss later. But in all of these areas, school feeding has a potential to catalyze change. Next slide, please. So on the basic arithmetic, as Sarah already mentioned, coverage is currently most limited where it could make the greatest difference, that is among the poorest people. Under 40% of children in low-income and lower-middle-income countries are covered. That's around 150 to 157 million children. But that means there are at least 240 million children in school who are not getting a school meal, and at least 60 million of primary school age alone who are out of school and could potentially be brought in to school if the benefits of school meals were available. So a targeted if you like, the low coverage is also a huge opportunity in all of those SDG areas that I mentioned. An added benefit is you don't have to reinvent the wheel here or create complex new institutions because much of the infrastructure is already in place. And what we try to set out in the report is the financing mechanisms that could accelerate progress. Next slide, please. So I'm really going to cut through a lot of detail in the report here. And I want to say right at the outset, there are a lot of uncertainties over the cost estimates because there are very big research gaps. My colleague Peter Haag has done a lot of detailed country research, which is referred to in the report that people can go and look at. We use a reference full cost figure for school feeding of around $64. That's based on an inflation-adjusted update of a study that was carried out in 2013. And we look at two scenarios. Both of the scenarios are a bit complicated, but to strip them down to their essentials, the first one basically just asks, what would it take to achieve 60% coverage? That would bring another 236 million children under the umbrella and within reach of school feeding programs. That's a high ambition scenario. Another scenario is a lower level of ambition, but it would still bring 162 million in. So both of those figures are more than consistent with the Brazil G20 goal. Next slide, please. So the annualized cost of achieving those outcomes based on those unit figures for the high ambition scenario are around 306 billion annually. For the lower ambition scenario is about 2.7 billion. And I should add that that includes a top-up cost for current budgets, most of which are well under that $64 figure. They're in the order of $42 annually. So without going into the detail, these are back of the envelope financing numbers based on the best cost estimates that we could come up with. Next slide, please. So the big question that arises is obviously how affordable is this? And with any affordability question, the answer really depends on which window you look through. If you look through the window of gross national income, these are quite small sums of money, even in low-income countries. They're well under 1% of GDP, actually under 0.5% for low-income countries, and a much smaller share in lower middle-income countries. But if you look at the number in relation to current budgets, the challenge is much more daunting. So per capita, it would be twice current education spending in low-income countries. You would have to increase budgets in low-income countries by a factor of 4 to achieve the 60% scenario, and in lower middle-income countries by around half. So these are big increases. Now, in a context where you've got countries grappling with unsustainable debt, which is already crowding out public spending, slower growth, which is reducing revenue collection, and major funding squeezes across health and education. This is clear. These targets will clearly not be achieved by low-income and low and middle-income countries solely on the basis of domestic resource mobilization. So we need more domestic resource mobilization, and we've estimated that figure at around 2.4 billion, but that would leave a gap of around 1.2 billion for international finance. Next slide, please. So what are the financing options? Well, if you look at domestic resource mobilization, the obvious best option is to increase revenue collection and to improve the efficiency and the equity of public spending, to move from general subsidies to more targeted subsidies and so on. But there are also a range of innovative financing options available. One of them is taxing public bad. So Colombia, for example, has just introduced a levy on ultra-processed foods, which could be used potentially to finance school meals, to transition from a public bad to a public good. You could, in many countries that have potentially large natural resource revenues coming on stream, part of those revenues could be earmarked for school feeding, so that you could convert, what is essentially short-term natural resource rents into long-term investment in human development. Climate finance currently completely bypasses school feeding, and there are big opportunities there. On the international side, and if there are any donors listening, as I hope there might be, the current aid effort, a one-word description is really derisory. It's currently around 287 million, much of it provided in the form of US agricultural surpluses rather than locally produced food. The delivery is fragmented. It's entirely lacking in strategic direction. So there are big opportunities there. Multilateral development banks currently invest very little in school feeding, and IDA 21 and the replenishment that is coming up is the big opportunity to change that picture. And I know Aki will be saying something about that. Debt relief and debt swaps. Gordon used the word unconscionable before. I would say if you want an illustration of unconscionable, you have around 300 million children going hungry when governments in those countries are spending more repaying creditors than they're spending on nutrition and health services and education, in many cases combined. There are innovative international taxation options. The Brazil G20 is looking at a wealth tax. There's a global solidarity levies task force, so there's an opportunity to influence that agenda. And we set out the case for potentially a new virtual fund, which could bring together and coordinate and pool resources effectively. So Sarah, I know I'm running over time, and I'm just going to end with a few really quick questions for the rest of the dialogue. So last slide. So here are really 5 biggish questions, which really just inviting other panelists to reflect on. So on the political economy, what are the political barriers to expanding school feeding programs? We can look at the cost benefit numbers, we can look at the evidence, but why doesn't this happen? What are the roadblocks? From evidence to impact, we have so much brilliant research on school feeding produced by the Research Consortium and many others. Why is it that research is not currently translating into the traction to drive change at the pace and the scale envisaged by the Brazil G20 and that 150 billion target. Aid donors. Aid donors speak a lot about investing money in areas with high impact. They talk a lot about value for money. Well, here you have a value for money option. Why aren't they taking it? That's another question. Breaking down silos. It often strikes me that when people look at school feeding, they look at it as an either or option. You know, it's either about nutrition, or it's about education, or it's about social protection, or it's about something else. But it's actually about many things, and it's precisely the mutually reinforcing nature of these benefits that make it so critical for an SDG recovery. And the final question, and this is for Roman, our panelist who will be speaking at the end, what can we learn from history? I mentioned those earlier movements, the great social reform movements of the early 19th century, the India school feeding movement, the Brazil school feeding initiative in Zero Hunger. What can we learn from the history of those movements to help us drive change right now? So Sarah, I'll leave it there and back to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and I'll aim to put all of those questions to the fantastic panel that we have. But before I introduce the panel, you made me think of something I heard President Lula say at Hunger this year, when he was talking about hunger. He was talking hunger in general, the level of hunger. And when we think about children going hungry, that should make us reflect even more. And, you know, where he said that the hunger today was not because of lack of money, lack of financing, but it was because of lack of shape. And I couldn't agree more, because having 300 million children going hungry should really put us all to shame. But that's what we're here to discuss. And the conversation, you know, is I'm anticipating, as Kevin has just mentioned, will focus around the politics, the financing, the evidence of this agenda. I have a fabulous panel. I'll introduce you only by the first line of your bio, otherwise we'll be here for the rest of the day. So I'm delighted that we have with us Ana Toni, the National Secretary for Climate Change for Brazil, and, you know, hot off the press, the newly elected Chief Negotiator for COP30. Congratulations, Ana. Along with Ana, we have Henry Musa Kpaka, who is the Minister of Agriculture of Sierra Leone, Elisabetta Aurino, Associate Professor of Development Economics at the University of Barcelona, Purnima Menon, Senior Director for Food and Nutrition at TIFPRI, Aki Nisha, I see you online, Aki, Vice President of Development Finance at the World Bank, Lisbeth Steer, Senior Advisor of Sustainable Financing Initiative for School Health and Nutrition and Chair of the ODI Global Washington Board. And last but not least, Roman Krznaric, the social philosopher and author of many books, including The History for Tomorrow and The Good Ancestor. Right, what an incredible group of panelists. But let me start with Mr. Kpaka, who I don't see immediately on my screen, but I hope it's there. Is the minister online? Excellent.
I am online and I can see you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, the case for expanding school feeding program is clearly really compelling, you know, both for education and for supporting rural livelihoods. But can you elaborate for our audience and the rest of the panel, really, for the discussion, what you think are the real constraints facing governments, and what role international cooperation could play to support national efforts, as Kevin was mentioning?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I also want to thank Kevin for really that run through. And I want to thank the organizers for having us join this platform. In Sierra Leone, we, so as the Minister of Agriculture and Food Security, I see myself as a nexus, really, as a holding place for linking the the traditional nutrition people, which often doesn't come from agriculture, but also the education people, but also the social protection people. So in our strategy that we've developed, the president decided for the next 5 years, Feed Salone, which is his flagship, would be the engine of both economic growth, job creation, addressing nutritional challenges across the country. And one of the most powerful sort of policy and activity areas that we identified in that strategy is school feeding. And we've been doing school feeding for a while, and I'll get to some of the numbers, but part of where we're pushing more aggressively is really around homegrown school feeding. Those of you that know, if you can't hear me, just let me know. My line may go on and off.
We hear you really well.
Perfect. Those of you that know a little bit about how school feeding works in places like here, we have the likes of WFP, CRS, Caritas, all doing good work, but a lot of them get their funding, and in most times also actually the funding comes in surpluses from farmers elsewhere, and they get to feed children here. Obviously, the children will get the nutritional benefits, they will learn and all of those things. But the catalytic nature of homegrown school feeding, which I champion, really is the one that we see that moves, pushes the envelope a little bit more in quickening our pace to be able to meet these SDG goals that are associated to these very powerful and all-round interventions. And so for us, it's a key part of our strategy. It allows us to interface other MDAs, ministries and agencies that we work with, departments and agencies, and reach schools and tackle malnutrition in very fundamental ways. And we do it, it's not just calories for us, also is around, it's around the types of nutrients that we're getting. So we're very mindful about not just calories, but micronutrient deficiencies, stunting. So from an agriculture point of view, we are pushing vitamin A, orange flesh, sweet potatoes to be fed in children in schools. We have yellow cassava that also help with that. We are we're conducting studies to understand the extent to which aflatoxin, which is a very deadly carcinogenic toxin in grains, maize, peanuts, that is in food, that we want to eliminate that, so that the food that children get in schools are very nutritious, but also healthy, and all of that. We also think, as part of our school feeding, which we now have a national school feeding policy, which was done by the Ministry of Education, but we as the Ministry of Agriculture sort of collaborate with them in implementation of that. Another benefits that we see, which they push very hard, is the local economics around that, which is around even the catering part of this. The women in these schools that are there to be able to cook and supply these schools with food, and the logistics from the agriculture point of view, where we have an ongoing effort with the Ministry of Education, where we're like, we want communities to be able to feed their own children themselves. And so we're mapping as a nexus, we map schools and areas where food can come from, and so that they so real quickly, the numbers for us for the past 5 years, up to 800,000 consistently, to past 3-4 years now, 800,000 children being fed. Coverage is around 40% for primary and pre-primary schools. So you ask about challenges, even having said all of this. A lot of what we're doing, we don't have 100% coverage. 800,000 is a small number for the children that we need to feed still. So there's a lot still that we need to do. One of the main areas I find as a major constraint is around budgeting.
Sorry, Minister, I think we've lost you. We can't hear you, Minister.
rice
Minister,
producers. Rice is our major crop here.
we lost
Yes,
you for a few
just-
seconds.
Okay, am I back? Great. So we passed the policy for rice that gets fed to schools, hospitals, all these institutions. We want the Ministry of Finance to give us all the vendors money to say, you have to buy the food locally because that's going to have a multiplier effect on production, demand, and all of that. Well, part of it is government, the way it works, at least in our system, is first of all, the government even owes money to vendors that feed. So that's a constraint. And I cannot go tell my farmers, supply government food when they are going to hold them, I don't know, a backlog of maybe a year or 2 years. That is going to kill the farming activities. And I cannot do that if they have other places. So it boils down to finance. There's political will, but the pressures are there. And so the questions that Kevin put at the end, we actually know the evidence, you know, and I think it's juxtaposing this evidence around value for money, which you also talked about a little bit. The evidence is clear. The nexus for, you know, homegrown school feeding, it's the nutrition, it's productivity, it's the market, it's educational outcomes that we see already going up. All these things is social. By the time you bring women and these women cooking, the logistics, there's a whole economy around that, right? So we know that, but it's just, and for us, we take all of these as one, but to push government to say, you need to put this money up front. You need to do it with tight budgets where we have to still pay debts that are a huge, substantial amount of the revenue that we collect becomes a constraint. So which is where I think for partners and donors that are listening, there are countries like Sierra Leone. We are very, very committed to doing this. We have smart programs we set up. We work across governments to be able to do this. But as a Minister of Agriculture, there are constraints. I can go to the Minister of Finance with my smart policies and design of the program, but every once in a while, he's hard up with other constraints, and that's where we can get supports to come in. So I don't know if I think I touched on the question a little bit, but feel free as the conversation goes, we can give you a bit more numbers and details for what we're doing.
That was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Minister. Unfortunately, we have lost Anna because she's been pulled into an urgent meeting related to COP. I'm really sorry because we were hoping that she would complement your remarks for this initial session on the politics of school feeding. But I'll go to the questions from the floor, and I know there is a question from Giuliana. I see you online, Giuliana Tangari. She's the director of Commedia do Amagna Institute. Over to you, Giuliana.
So, hello, Sarah. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. Congratulations for the panelists, Sustainable Financing Initiative, the Learning Generation Initiative, and ODI Global. Actually, I was hoping to have the opportunity to talk and question after Secretary Anatoni, but I will talk from a Brazilian perspective, and even though she's not here, maybe it's useful for us to keep the debate on. So, as we are speaking now, the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty is being launched right now in Brazil. And one of its 6 announced goals or sprints is actually make more 150 million children in low and lower middle income countries benefit from school meals programs by 2030. And as this report shows, there is a vast typology of school meals programs, from snacks, biscuits, to a comprehensive and healthy and nutritious hot meals universally served for every student in public school. And I think that as a category further in this ladder, as Minister had said before, the best program will be that one that will attach to the goal of nutrition security, the power of food procurement. So in Brazil, since 2009, school feeding procurement has been designed to support family farmers, to fight rural poverty and secure domestic food supply. And although we assume that by supporting family farming, we are supporting sustainable food production, and maybe that's a good assumption, there is no policy design in the case of Brazil, especially designed to really drive agroecological transition and support local family ecological production. Well, Brazil has announced 2 days ago, to couple with this Global Alliance School Meals Sprint, that the country will expand sustainability concerns when purchasing from family farming, including organic food. But Brazil has also announced its new NDC in COP29, and there is no reference to ecological transition in food systems. And we know that the current agri-food monotony is a major climate challenge, not only due to emissions, but for the normal loss of biodiversity, loss of crop diversity, chemical pollution, and intense use of natural resources. So my point is to fight food monotony, to increase school feeding nutritious supply. What is the clear incentive for local ecological farming transition through public food procurement from school feeding meals and school feeding programs that is still missing?
Thanks, Juliana. I'm sorry that you couldn't put the question directly to Secretary Anatoni. But Kemi, I don't know if there are a lot of questions in the chat, but I'm also mindful that we are running out of time for the other sessions. So if you have any immediate, sort of response to the points that the minister has raised and Juliana has put, and anything else you've seen in the chat, otherwise I'll move to the next session on the financing.
Yeah, I think that's a great bridging question, actually, Sarah, because I think the minister has set out really clearly the budget and real financial constraints facing countries like Sierra Leone that are really trying to do the right thing. And I think Juliana has, really highlighted how difficult it is, or how there is sometimes a gap between the climate financing aspects of the transition and the sort of, if you like, the more conventional financing approaches to school feeding. So it's a really good segue, I think, into the financing session. So I won't say anything more at this stage, Sarah.
Okay, and there are a few questions that we can put to all of you after the financing session. So let me straight away go to Aki Nisho. So Aki, you've heard the comments from the minister, and of course what Kevin said at the beginning coming from the report. So based on the ODI SFI report, it really appears to be very little donor finance going into school feeding, including from IDA. So what do you see as the underlying causes of that? How could the IDA school feeding portfolio be expanded?
Right. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think by way of responding to your question, I will take you through a brief slide so that you could see how the aid flows have gone to school feeding programs and what are the things that IDA can help with and IDA can do. So first of all, I wanted to comment on what Kevin said at the beginning about the history of school feeding. And I wanted to say that in post-war Japan, this was a big thing as well, because there was widespread malnutrition. And I personally benefited from that program, which was based on skimmed milk powder and also all sorts of surplus agricultural products imported from countries like the US at low prices. So that has been a huge thing, even in Japan. Today's presentation will have the three main objectives. First, to provide a brief overview of how the current economic outlook plays into all this. Second, I will discuss the role of the World Bank in financing school feeding programs and also our future goals. And third, a few reflections on how IDA offers financial efficiency and other advantages to help close the gap in the financing of school meals. Next slide, please. So let me start with a bit of context by emphasizing how the current global economic landscape remains cloudy with a mixed picture of progress and uncertainty. While a widely anticipated global recession has been averted, the successive shocks in the wake of the pandemic have stalled progress in the fight against poverty, leaving nearly 700 million people worldwide still trapped in extreme poverty today. Poverty and hunger go hand in hand, and in this context, according to the ODI report that we have been talking about, there is a high and rising number of children experiencing hunger and malnutrition in developing countries. As you can see in the chart on the right in this slide, some 258 million children were living with hunger in low-income and low-middle-income countries in 2023, that is. And that represents an increase of 55 million children over the level observed in 2015. These trends do not offer cause for optimism. If the current trajectory doesn't change, the number of people living with hunger in 2030 will be around the same level as in 2015 when the SDGs were adopted. Next slide, please. Let me also mention that the increasing complexity in the global aid architecture doesn't offer any respite for the fight against poverty and hunger and for the achievement of the SDGs. As you can see in this slide, this is a rather busy slide, so just be very brief. As you can see in this slide, there have been high levels of aid circumvention with less than 40% of official financing flows going through recipient countries' national budgets, a growing share of ODA being channeled to facilities that provide no leveraging, a proliferation of donor channels, and a growing fragmentation of aid projects, resulting in a larger number of donor-funded projects of a smaller financial size. Next slide, please. When we zero in on the health sector, the situation is not very different. As you can see on the picture on the left in this slide, there has been a significant proliferation of donors in the sector, leading to growing complexity due to the existence of multiple donor channels and multiple priorities that end up taxing the limited capacity of recipient countries. In this context, financing for school feeding remains highly fragmented and aligned with individual donor priorities. As a result, most countries receive only small amounts of funding directed towards modest projects, which are often delivered off budget and through intermediaries. Next slide, please. The World Bank provides substantive financing for school feeding and has benefited 20 million children with school meals across 71 projects in 36 countries, totaling $282 million. IDA is responsible for nearly 80% of this amount, which represents 219 million in school feeding financing that we deploy by working with a number of implementing partners. And this can be scaled up. As Kevin said, IDA 21 is a major opportunity to scale this up. Next slide, please. IDA is also focused on achieving more ambitious goals. At the launch of the G20 Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty in July, President Banga announced our goal to scale up social protection programs to support at least 500 million people by 2030. Now, why can IDA scale up in such ambitious ways? This is for mainly 4 reasons. We have the leveraging capacity. $1 from a donor country goes out as $3.50. We have the country presence. And we have people in just about every poor country working with the clients. We also have global knowledge. We can learn from countries and transmit them to others. And finally, we work in partnerships with all kinds of partners. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. Let me conclude by mentioning that IDA offers unmatched financial efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, through the leveraging model. Also, this comes at we can offer this at a time when the global aid landscape is marked by fragmentation and proliferation. IDA is a defragmenter in the sense that it provides a large-scale platform for development partners to work with. And also, let me again come back to the question of the opportunity that the IDA 21 represents. We are now 3 weeks away from the final pledging. We have right now the G20 summit going on. We have a bunch of countries who have announced very high increases. For instance, I just came back from Warsaw. Poland has announced a doubling of its contribution to IDA. And Denmark, Spain, Latvia have all increased significantly. Today, you will hear from some other countries at the summit that they will increase significantly. So we are counting on the support of the international community, and we really hope that we can work together to serve the poor people, including those through the school feeding programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aki, for such a comprehensive illustration of where the other resources get spent. But I think it'd be good to go even further into some of the obstacles to make more of the other resources for school feeding in particular. But let me first put a related question to Lisbeth Stier. Lisbeth, there is a lot of talk about innovative finance. I mean, IDA, of course, is a predictable resource. It's one that is well known and well understood. But there is also increasingly discussions around what innovative finance can do, whether it can play an expanded role. If so, how?
Great. Can you hear me, Sarah? Well, perfect. So I wanted to talk about 3 things with respect to how we overcome some of these barriers that Kevin was setting out in his presentation and the questions he was raising at the end. And there are essentially 3 things I think that we really need to focus on. One is with regards to the political mobilization around the financing and making the case for investment. So before we can talk about innovative financing, we have a job to do with actually making the case for investments. As Kevin was saying earlier, in many donor agencies and possibly also governments, the impact of school meals is evaluated in a siloed way. That doesn't account for the multiple benefits and doesn't add them up. And actually, I had this very interesting situation where one of the executive directors to the World Bank was invited to a dinner at my house to talk about school meals. And he wrote back to his headquarters to get a briefing on what should he say about school meals. And he actually told us the story of, he wrote to the education department and the education department said, well, if you need to spend $60 on school meals, our total education budgets are only $200 in low-income countries. So no, bad investment. If you go to then the health group, they have a similar argument. And the problem is that we're not adding this up. And within donor agencies and within the way we are working across departments, we are not yet telling this compelling story. We're doing good work, we're doing good research, but we need to do better in bringing these multiple benefits together. Equally, as Kevin was saying, we have these numbers of $1 turns into $9 in terms of the returns on investment. Well, it's actually difficult to evaluate that. What does that actually mean in terms of future costs or revenue flows? What we should do potentially is look into what does this mean if we invest in school meals for government revenues and impacts on growth further down the line. So make it really real in terms of what this means in terms of both spending and then revenues over time. So ministers of finance can really engage with this. And the same could be said about the impacts on poverty reduction and so on. So I'd really make a big plea, first of all, to make this political case in a way that's accessible to people. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity, obviously, with the G20 and the alliance being created That's a great way to go. We also have, obviously, the replenishments of the major multilateral institutions. We also have the Rockefeller Foundation that's about to launch a big bet on with many partners on school feeding. Again, in each of these, we could really work on the politics, and we've suggested to create a kind of champions group to do that. The second challenge is about how we actually make the political case for innovative financing specifically. And when we talk about the earmark taxes, as Kevin was saying, or some of these other proposals with regards to taxing sugar-sweet beverages, there is a lot of politics involved. And I know Kevin can give examples that he has looked at across the world where they've overcome these politics. Politics of corporations who don't want to be taxed, politics of actually public finance experts who do not like earmark taxes. So how have countries who've done that really successfully, like the Philippines, how have they made this political case for innovative financing, for these examples that Kevin rightly has identified, which have been successful in countries? So understanding and making the political case about these specific innovative financing instruments is really important. And then on the international side, I would say, yes, thank you, Aki. I'm very happy you will put school meals as a priority in the IDA replenishment. That's absolutely essential. We have other instruments as well, like the International Finance Facility for Education that was developed to use government guarantees that actually turns $1 into $7 because it uses guarantees as a mechanism to leverage the balance sheets of the MDBs. And it would be amazing if the sum total of 300 million currently coming from donors could be doubled with the help of the multilateral development banks through IDA, through instruments like the International Finance Facility. Similarly, when we talk about debt conversion and debt swap efforts, the key here will be to really engage with other actors who are really good at this already. We have the climate sector is already doing this. I don't think we can go on our own to make the case for debt swaps for school meals, perhaps, but maybe how could we engage with some of these other debt swaps and make common cause with other sectors? And this leads me to my final point. Because I am here at COP29 in Baku, and there's a lot of talk about food. Food became a big issue in the last COP at COP28. There have been initiatives launched. We now have an action food hub. We have a call to action on food systems. We should be here. We need to be on the ground here in these conversations on food system change. One of the things that are being asked for is to support local farmers. We just heard from our colleague in Sierra Leone, from the minister. This is the great way to work with local farmers if we make this homegrown. But we are not really here. The case has not yet been made compellingly and consistently with these communities on the ground here talking about food system transformation. So a big call for us all to turn up in big numbers in Brazil at COP30, because I know the Brazilians are going to get this right. So thank you so much.
100%. Thank you very much, Lisbeth. And yes, it's exciting that we can have the two agendas finally connected. We are struggling to stay on time, but let me go straight to the questions. And I can see Carmen Burbano, the Director of School Meals and Social Protection at WFP. Carmen, I'll give you the floor to ask a question to the panelists. I would also like to encourage my panelists to look at the Q&A in the chat. It's going to be impossible to give you the time to respond to them online, but maybe you can fill the questions in the chat. I'm sure our colleagues will really appreciate it. Carmen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Kevin and Lisbeth and everybody, because this report and the launch has been in the making for a while. It's wonderful to see this information coming and seeing the light of day, and everybody connected here watching this. And now we can share this with many people. Aki, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I have a question for you. We've been, as Sarah mentioned, I'm the I'm the Director of School Meals and Social Protection for WFP, but I'm also the Director of the School Meals Coalition Secretariat. I've been involved in the school meals topic for many, many years, working with colleagues from the World Bank for decades now. And I have to say that the story that Lisbeth just told about going to one part of the bank and them saying, well, this seems like a good idea for education, but not the most important idea. And then we go to the colleagues in agriculture and the same. It seems like a good idea, but where is the investment in health? And then we go to health, and it's the same kind of rigmarole of kind of this carousel that we go into if we're looking at different sectors that are just looking at this issue sectorally. So, you know, having, for example, you mentioned this, is just what we need. We need leaders that are bringing the kind of the higher level picture that can actually connect these different conversations together and basically say, what could we do if we're talking about, for example, IDA replenishment, IDA 21? So my question is, how can we help with positioning this topic under the IDA conversation? What do you need from us, your partners, from the World Food Program, from UNICEF, from the NGOs that are behind this space, from ODI, the think tanks, the researchers, et cetera? The storyline is very clear. And one of the things that we know now is that governments are very much behind this agenda. So what can we do to get the bank fully on board here? We would really welcome some ideas. Thanks.
Do you want me to respond?
Yes, over to you, because I still have 3 panelists to bring in.
Okay, so very quickly, I hear you about the rigmarole. Now, historically, school feeding has been done by different parts of the bank, but there has been a decision that the social protection group will lead this. This is under the global director, Ifat Sharif. And she has been quite active and dynamic in this effort. So I would urge you to talk to her. And I think, you know, as far as IDA 21 is concerned, we're almost at the end of this, and the policy framework is almost agreed upon. But I think it would be very useful if the WFP and other partners could really push donors to come up with as high a envelope as possible. And this is being cooked right now as we speak. So push for a higher amount, and also at the country level. You mentioned that many country governments are very much committed to this. At the country level, and we work on the basis of a country-based model. So at the country level, because the IDA envelope is a zero-sum game, try to really emphasize the importance of school feeding. We can, I think, in certain cases where there is extreme food insecurity, you can draw on the crisis response window of IDA, which provides $50 million per country. So advice like that to the countries will be also very useful. Let me stop right there.
Thank you so much, Aki. There are a few questions on financing in the chat. Please do try and address them. But let me move to the last section of the conversation, which is really focused on the evidence for school meals. Purnima, I mean, if the evidence is so compelling, why is the current reach of school feeding programs in low and middle income countries so limited in your view?
So, you know, I want to firstly let me congratulate you and everyone else on the report. I think it's been really fantastic to see it come together, and this is an area that is of great interest to those of us who work on issues that connect social protection and nutrition at IFPRI, and of course education outcomes. So, I want to reflect a little bit, or maybe pick up on what Lisbeth was saying. I think we have to sort of really acknowledge the fact that the way the evidence is put out and the level of evidence that we have on school meal and school feeding programs is still quite patchy, right? So what we are hearing about, and what we've been hearing about for about a year or so or more now, to say, school meal programs have tremendous potential to transform food systems. We are still talking about the potential. I think if you really look at, well, what is the evidence on the many transformative actions there, it just isn't quite as strong as the evidence that says, you know, when we put in place school meal programs, we do have impacts on, of course, on education outcomes, on attendance, and in some cases, you know, if the nutrition components are delivered well, on nutrition. And so I think a part of it requires us to take a hard look at the evidence against the potential that we're, you know, in a sense, offering through, I think, what has been a lot of advocacy for school meals here. All it takes is for, you know, for some perceptions of gaps, and we start to lose people's interest. You know, they go, oh, well, you know, we don't see this as being as strong, or we, you know, don't quite see this here. And I think that's why you have the situation where, you know, the education people may not fully own it, the agriculture people may not fully own it, the health and nutrition people may not fully own it. And I do want to say that, you know, notwithstanding the issue of what I'm going to call the anticipated or the known food systems outcomes, I mean, clearly the investments in school meals should continue. In the Lancet series on adolescent nutrition that we, you know, a group of us worked on for over 2 years and released towards the end of 21-22, you know, we really called out the critical importance of this platform to deliver much more than is currently happening, but for nutrition. And, you know, there is a part of me that worries about, you know, when you use the term school feeding, when you use the term school meal, you're still not walking the way towards, you know, people who are looking, for example, for a complete package that addresses all aspects of school nutrition, right? So people who talk about schools and the potential of schools in the area of nutrition will say, well, you know, what we'd like to see is healthy meals, work on the school nutrition and school food environments, nutrition education in the school curriculum, and then we can talk and be part of this journey as, you know, people who worry about those outcomes, right? So, you know, what I'm going to say is that we need an accompanying really fairly high level of evidence building as we walk along with this, because what we have right now is a lot of discourse and a lot of advocacy on the real potential for these programs, but it really depends on a lot. You know, it depends on the investments we see from governments. It depends on, you know, the extent to which you have enough components of these programs operating in ways that deliver those additional outcomes, right? I mean, Brazil's school meal program has many of those components that have come in. This is not necessarily true in many other countries, and that means that as governments decide to and you know, I would agree with others because there is a tremendous amount of interest in this platform today, tremendous. What I'd also like to see is an accompanying interest in building the evidence base as we walk forward with it. You know, let's test the assumptions. Let's be honest about what we find works, what we find doesn't work. Let's, you know, let's do the research on fixing the things. I mean, you know, I've worked my entire life almost in the 1,000-day window, where sometimes it takes you 5 years to know whether an intervention works or not. This is not how it works in the world of school meals and school feeding programs. In 1 year, in one school year, you're able to document more, you know, more really a wide range of evidence around how certain changes in programs can work. And I think that's very appealing from the perspective of, you know, also of research and evidence building. You know, so I'm going to say we need a high level of investment in impact evaluation, in implementation research, possibly in modeling out different scenarios. You know, we're trying to do some work on that, and we'll reach out to many of you on this group here. But also political economy research, because, you know, we have to document both the barriers, but also, you know, do some high level and high quality research on documenting the successes of where things worked. What were the ingredients that came into place? Are those ingredients transferable to other contexts? What do things look like when you transfer those ingredients? So, you know, I'm sure Elizabeth will also have lots of, you know, comments to offer on the importance of building an evidence agenda. But I will say this, you know, this is what has worked to keep, for example, the issue of the first 1,000 days of a child on the agenda for the last 15 years. It has literally never fallen off the agenda. And a big reason for that has just been this intense building of evidence and then evidence-based engagement. And, you know, I think this topic is really ready for that level of investment. You know, we can all come together around it. be honest about what we can say today, what we want to be able to say, and work towards building that evidence together. It's an important moment in history. I mean, I just haven't seen as much interest, excitement, and commitment to this as I have in recent years. And the question is, are we going to seize it or are we going to lose it? So let me stop there and can happily take some questions later. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Purnima. So let me go to Elizabeth. You just mentioned, and there's something that is also in the chat that would be useful, Elizabeth, to hear you reflect more about, which is why hasn't school feeding figured with greater prominence in donor approaches that emphasize best by practices?
Yeah, thank you very much. So for me as a researcher, it's very exciting to be here and talk about my research on school meals and reflecting with you that are more practitioners or policymakers on these issues. So I guess to tackle directly your question, Sarah, I think, and this has come across different previous panelists, so like Lisbeth and now Purnima, I think one critical evidence gap relates really to this, to the challenge of putting together these different benefits in a single metrics. And that is that's why it's hard to then kind of talk to different sectoral policymakers about school meals, because we know the evidence on education, we know the evidence on nutrition, agriculture is even more patchy, but it's hard. So we actually been trying to get to an estimates of the value of school meals that kind of may take into account both the long-term impacts from increased human capital development as part of the meals with the social protection part, which is something that we tend to forget about when we talk about school meals effects. This is a transfer that really supports the poorest households and the poorest children. And but when we try when we think about the effects of school meals, it's hard to put these distributional effects into a single metrics with the human capital returns. And we found that actually school meals are quite cost effective. So for instance, building on our study in Ghana that I will talk about in a few minutes, kids that receive school meals for 2 years are estimated to earn between $300 and $800 additional dollars in discounted lifetime wages. And interestingly, half of these, depending on the different scenarios and simulation, are really returns to current poverty reduction. So I think we are actually working to resubmit this study for publication. So I think that could help the policy making and the kind of the case for school meals by giving more a sense of how to put together these different benefits that school meals can offer. So should I talk about school, like the Ghana evidence more broadly? Something
very succinctly, please, Elizabeth.
Okay. So actually, I wanted to talk about 2 studies. I'm sorry. One is Ghana, because it's more developmental setting, and one is Mali, and more in a humanitarian context, because I think it gives us an idea of what school meals can achieve, and not the potential of school meals, but what they actually achieved in these 2 different scenarios. Ghana is interesting because it has been incredibly successful to enroll many children, not only in primary, but also in early childhood and junior secondary. But still learning is a main critical issue. We have 80% of kids in Ghana that at the end of primary cannot read a very, very simple sentence or do basic arithmetics. And what we found after 2 years of the government-led program, which is something I really like to emphasize, that is a government-led finance program at scale across all of the country, we found that for the average child, school meals contributed to improve learning by almost 1 additional learning adjusted years of school. And for girls and poorest kids, we had very, very large increase, up to 1.6 learning adjusted years of school. This is a measure that puts together the kind of quantity of and quantity of school plus the productivity of the school, how much kids can learn in 1 year of school. And also we found that in Ghana, the effects there were effects on nutrition for girls and poorest children, which is interesting because usually we think that it's harder to shift height, for instance, for middle-aged primary school children. Whilst in Mali, this was instead a humanitarian evaluation of the humanitarian program by the World Food Programme, we found that school meals improved enrollment. So as Kevin mentioned at the beginning of this event, we have the educational crisis affects learning and enrollment for a pocket of 120 million of children. And these are mostly in conflict or humanitarian settings. So we found in this setting that actually kids and girls were positively affected by school meals. I'll stop here, but I could talk more.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I was keeping an eye on the questions coming in, but thanks, Kevin, and others who are trying to address some of the questions in the chat. Really much appreciated. Let me open just on this segment, and I'll go to Nicola Oquero from Food for Education.
Thank you very much. I resonated a lot with what was said by Dr. Pouname and Elisabetta. And when I think of the gap between the research that we have and uptake in policy, there are two things that come to mind. One is the evidence that really demonstrate the holistic nature of school feeding programs. You know, it's widely known that school feeding programs will increase enrollment, attendance, and various other education outcomes. But if we claim that school feeding is this holistic solution, how else can we provide that evidence that really demonstrates that? So that's one. And the second thing is what evidence do we have on the cost effectiveness of actually running a school feeding program that we can then provide to the governments who are interested? And on this, you know, I look back at what Food for Education has been able to accomplish, feeding nearly 500,000 learners in Kenya through partnerships with county governments in Kenya. We are able to provide not just the evidence on enrollment and attendance going up by as much as 20% in some of the sites that we're working in, but also looking at what the employment that these school feeding programs are bringing to the community, as well as the costing per household that goes towards the provision of meals for learners in schools versus how much money the parents would be able to pay for a meal that is provided to a child who is already in a school that is providing meals through government support. So looking at the percentage of minimum wage that goes towards meals for parents who are benefiting from school feeding programs versus those who are not benefiting from school feeding programs. In addition, you're also looking at the contribution towards nutritional needs in learners who get additional calorific intake as well as nutritional intake in school feeding programs versus those who are not getting that benefit. So how can we better present evidence intentionally directed towards government to support and accelerate the uptake of school feeding programs? So going beyond the improvements in education outcome, but really touching on some of the things that need to be addressed, such as the holistic nature of it, as well as the financial sustainability of it. Thank you.
Thanks. Purnima or Elisabetta, who wants to address, or anyone who wants to address the question briefly?
I'm happy to take the first part of it, and then I think Elisabetta could maybe talk about the cost effectiveness. So, I think the best way to, to build the evidence is to make sure that the research is done as new approaches or innovations in programs roll out. I think there's often assumptions made about, the wide-ranging impacts or the narrow impacts of different things, and just having a sit down with people in any context to say, listen, what are the different types of outcomes we can anticipate? And what can we do to measure them credibly, and to attribute them to the programs that we are, wanting to say something about it. These are, conversations we hold with people designing and sort of deploying programs around the world. And a good evaluator can really help you with putting together the evidence that should come together on the story. I just always say that, we should be always prepared for disappointment too. We may think something is going to have some big effect, and sometimes it has only a few different little effects, and we have to be prepared for that. And then, good evaluators will also be able to tell you why we see what we see, why we don't see what we don't see, and why we don't see what we see, and then, carry on the journey. So I would say partnership with researchers, it can do a lot here for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Purnima. Elisabetta, any quick addition?
Yeah, on the cost effectiveness, I'm really pleased that Nicola brought up this the idea of the value, how much parents value the transfer, because this is something that has been not studied widely, and again another evidence gap. But in a few studies we saw that actually parents value the transfer given by the program at a higher level compared with the cost of the program. So this is something we tend to forget in economic evaluation of school meals. So we are working towards this tool really to bring together these different aspects, including this redistributional transfer. So I hope this will serve as a tool to support the case for school feeding. But it's true that cost data are hard to obtain, and this is something that should be also part of the monitoring and evaluation system. So I really like Purnima's comment around how we embed a sound monitoring and evaluation system as we scale up school meals as part of this movement. So I think that will be really critical, because we still have some gaps in the evidence base.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta. We're coming very much to the end of this conversation, but this is the right moment to bring you in, Roman, because, we've heard a lot, and a lot that is perhaps a bit more technical than political. I think it would be really great to hear your insights from the historical context, the lessons, what aspects of political economy really we can emphasize to drive reform in the school feeding system. We often fall back to the evidence, also to the eye. We think that the research can drive the change, but we know that we need to shift narratives, and we need to really look at the political and social drivers for reform if you want to really change things. So what key historical lessons can inform how we frame and advocate for school feeding initiatives that can be politically backed?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. And of course, that refers back to, I think, the first and the fifth questions that Kevin raised about political economy and about the lessons of history, really, because I think, history is one of our most undervalued resources for thinking about the future of humanity. And we have kind of vast amounts of the stuff to tap into. And what I love about this report is the way that it takes history so seriously, drawing out the lessons from, the 1906 reform in Britain and the early school feeding programs in the US and India, bringing it up to the present. And, you wouldn't drive a car without looking in the rear vision mirror. But I think that's often so what happens with politicians and policymakers. A lot of governments talk about having foresight units. I think this report shows the importance of having backsight units, where we really learn systematically from what's gone on in the past. And I think one of the really important things to tap into here on the political economy side, which hasn't really been mentioned, actually relates to an image from a new book of mine, or a kind of model. I just want to share one picture here. You should be able to see there. It's a model of how change happens from a recent book of mine called History for Tomorrow. And what it does is it tries to sort of summarize under what conditions do governments tend to undertake rapid transformative change. Now, sometimes these things happen when there are things like wars. Britain introduces rationing, or a pandemic. You stop people flying wherever. But outside those kinds of situations, when do we get the kinds of changes we need to have these urgent policy reforms like what we're talking about here today? It seems to me that three things need to come together. You need to have some kind of crisis, like a melting ice sheet or a financial crash. You need new ideas in the room, or visionary ideas for change. And then you need a third aspect, which are the disruptive movements you can see in the corner of that triangle. So Berlin, 1989, why did the East German government fall? Because you had a crisis in the leadership. You had new ideas, or old ideas really, about freedom of movement and freedom of speech, and you had the disruptive movements as well. And I think what's so important here in the story that we've heard about the history of school meals is that, there is a crisis going on here. I think this report is actually offering the new ideas and offering the historical basis for the ideas of why this matters. And I think what we need to talk about more are the importance of the movements part. We know historically they've been important. So the question really comes up, how do we sort of tap into, because, historically you can think of so many disruptive movements which have empowered change, whether it's the movement for Indian independence, suffragettes, US civil rights movement. So when I hear all of you speaking, and I have no great expertise in this area at all, what I hear is, I think, yes, we need financing for the programs themselves, but we also need to support the national movements for change, the advocacy movements, the social reformers that have historically been so important and clearly, I'm sure, are so important today. And we also need to support the international networks, which are in part of that advocacy. So I guess I would like to see donors and other kind of philanthropists and others trying to empower those who are the key change makers in putting this issue bang right into the middle of the agenda. That seems so fundamental to me. And just to say one other thing, as I've been listening, I've been thinking about the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who in the 1950s was famous for developing the first polio vaccine. He was very interested in all the issues you've been talking about today. And one of the things he did say late in his life in the 1970s, he said, the great question facing us is this: are we being good ancestors? Are we being good ancestors? How will we be remembered by the generations to come? And it seems to me that this policy, this idea of school meals, school feeding, has so many potential benefits, across all those areas of health and education and gender and climate and sustainable farming, that to be a good ancestor, this should really be at the center of international and national policy agendas. And with that, let me stop.
Thank you so much, Roman. This resonates so much. It's very much the journey ODI has been on, from just producing evidence to really trying to work coalition of change makers, as I say, social reformers, international networks, because that is the way to drive agendas of change. We are very much at time, but Kevin, any final thoughts from you?
Well, Sarah, Roman has just summarized it brilliantly. And actually, I think the coalition of people we have on this call, brilliant researchers, people like Aki, Carmen, working in institutions to drive change, ODI, part of the sort of public policy facing community, is sort of what we need to drive things forward. And Juliana and others who are leading civil society organizations. I mean, maybe just to, Aki gave, I think, a brilliant personal reflection. And if you ask people of my age in the UK about school feeding, they'd probably reflect on watery, lumpy custard and overcooked cabbage. But actually, school feeding in the UK was established, it's a fundamental bedrock of the social welfare state in Britain. If you look in Brazil, it's a fundamental bedrock of the whole social protection system. So this is something that can really change people's lives. It's practical, the infrastructure is in place. And maybe just to end on a really practical point, because obviously I agree with a lot of what has been said, but I think Aki's appeal on the financing side is so important, because if we're speaking honestly, and you look at the aid structure for school feeding right now, it perfectly mirrors what Aki set out. You've got large numbers of donors financing piddling little projects all over the world with no connection, with very high transaction costs. And it's a massive disservice to these 300 million children. And, this is all in the interest of donors putting their flag on their little project or getting rid of US agricultural surpluses. And I think what we need is a mechanism that pulls resources, that does it in an efficient and strategic way, that doesn't allow donors to earmark, And that's sort of what IDA does. There are many other mechanisms that we can use as well. But that's really critical. And maybe just to close, Sarah, that to go back to Roman's point, in the end, you can research this and build evidence until the cows come home. If you don't build the political movements and the coalitions, nothing happens. And so this is really about, I think all of those great success stories are stories of the fusing of urgent need, children going hungry, compelling narratives, engagement with policymakers, and committed campaigning. They're the ingredients for success. None of them are enough on their own, but you put them together and you get the magic. And I'd encourage everyone to buy Roman's book, by the way, it's brilliant.
Sounds like it, I definitely will. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you to all the incredible panelists we had today. And I think that was such a fitting conclusion. This is already, clearly a coalition that can lead to transformative change. There are political processes out there that are, in a way, well set up for us to try and influence. Of course, we've got the newly created Alliance on Hunger and Poverty. Kevin, just one or two things about that too. And we have the road, to Belém and COP30 that I think provide opportunities to continue to influence how we can put the importance of nutrition for children through school feeding and other ways, and link to better food systems on the map, cutting across barriers and really bringing together the researchers, the policymakers, the donors, making better use of the financing that is available. I'm sure we'll all continue to discuss this. I'm sorry that Anna-Toni could not be with us in the end, but we wish her well, and we can convey all of the things that have been discussed today, so that in the road to COP30, we can continue to find avenues to converge towards the transformation that we need. Thank you very much to everyone who is online for your very numerous questions. I hope the brilliant minds that we have on these conversations will find 5 minutes to address your questions. Thank you very much, and until next time.